The drought of 1892 had turned the Oklahoma Territory into a wasteland of dust and desperation. Sarah Mitchell stood outside the general store in the small town of Red Creek, her hand trembling as she touched the long braid that hung down her back, the same golden braid her husband had loved to wind around his fingers before the fever took him 6 months ago. In her other arm she held Emma, her 3-year-old daughter, who had stopped crying from hunger 2 days ago, a silence far more terrifying than any tears. The store owner, Mr. Hutchins, had made his position clear. No money, no credit, no food. But he had noticed Sarah's hair, thick and lustrous despite everything, and had made an offer that made her stomach turn. $20 for her braid, enough for flour, beans, and salt pork to last them a month, maybe 2 if she was careful. Sarah had already sold everything else. The wedding ring had gone first, then the silver locket her mother had given her, then the quilts, the dishes, even Jacob's pocket watch that she had sworn to keep for Emma. The small homestead her husband had claimed sat empty now. The crops withered, the well nearly dry. The dream of building a life in this harsh land crumbling like the parched earth beneath her feet. She had come to town with the last thing of value she possessed, prepared to make a trade that would mark her forever as the woman so desperate she had sold her own hair. But before you judge her choice, before you wonder if there was another way, let me tell you about the moment that changed everything, about a stranger who saw past desperation to dignity, and about how a single act of kindness can ripple forward through generations. Sarah was reaching for the scissors Mr. Hutchins had placed on the counter, tears streaming down her face, when the door opened and a man walked in, trailing dust and the smell of leather and horses. He was tall, weather-beaten, with eyes the color of a stormy sky and a black hat pulled low over his face. A cowboy, clearly probably just passing through on his way to somewhere better than Red Creek. Sarah barely noticed him, focused as she was on gathering the courage to let those scissors touch her hair, the last piece of herself that still felt like hers. But the cowboy noticed her. More specifically, he noticed the little girl in her arms, pale and listless, and a desperate determination in the mother's eyes, and the way her hand shook as she picked up those scissors. "Hold on there, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the slow drawl of Texas. Sarah froze, turning to look at him with a mixture of hope and humiliation. The cowboy stepped closer, his boots loud on the wooden floor, and addressed Mr. Hutchins directly. "How much food were you planning to give the lady for her hair?" Mr. Hutchins, annoyed at the interruption, named a sum. The cowboy nodded slowly, then reached into his vest and pulled out a worn leather wallet. "I'll pay double that amount, but the lady keeps her hair. Load up supplies for them, enough for 2 months, and include some of that chocolate you keep behind the counter for the little one." Mr. Hutchins started to protest, but something in the cowboy's eyes made him think better of it. Sarah couldn't speak. She stood there holding Emma, watching as this stranger counted out bills that represented more money than she had seen in months, asking for nothing in return. When she finally found her voice, it came out as a whisper. "I can't accept this. I don't even know your name. How would I ever repay you?" The cowboy smiled, a sad, knowing smile that seemed to carry its own story of loss. "Name's James Thornton, ma'am, and you don't owe me anything. I knew a woman once, a long time ago, who had to make choices no person should have to make. I wasn't there to help her then. Maybe this balances the scales a little." He tipped his hat and turned to leave, but Sarah's voice stopped him. "Wait, please. At least tell me why. Why would you do this for strangers?" James turned back, and for a moment, the hardness in his face softened. "My mother," he said quietly, "after my father died in the war, she did what she had to do to keep me and my sisters fed. Sold everything we had, including her wedding ring and her grandmother's china. One winter, when things got real bad, she cut her hair and sold it to a wig maker in St. Louis for $8. I was 10 years old, and I remember watching her cry that night, touching her short hair like she'd lost a part of herself. She never grew it long again. Said every time she looked in the mirror, she wanted to remember what desperation felt like, so she'd never look down on anyone else going through hard times." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I swore then that if I ever had the means, I'd help folks before they got to that point. Your girl looks about the age I was. Some things a child shouldn't have to remember." Over the following days, Sarah learned that James Thornton wasn't just passing through. He was a ranch foreman on his way back to Montana after delivering a cattle herd to Kansas City, and he had decided to stay in Red Creek for a spell, taking a room at the boarding house and helping out wherever work was needed. He fixed the roof on the church that had been leaking for 2 years. He helped old Mr. Peterson repair his fence, and every evening he would stop by Sarah's homestead with something: firewood he'd split, a rabbit he'd shot, once even a bag of oats for the mule she'd somehow managed to keep. He never stayed long, never asked for anything, just tipped his hat and rode off into the gathering darkness. Sarah found herself watching for his visits, found herself taking more care with her appearance, brushing out her long hair and pinning it up the way Jacob used to like. Emma, who had barely spoken since her father's death, started smiling again, running to the door when she heard horse hooves, calling out Mr. James. With a joy that made Sarah's heart ache, she knew she was falling for this stranger, this cowboy with sad eyes and a generous heart. But she also knew that men like James Thornton didn't settle down with widows and orphans. They were tumbleweed souls, always moving, never staying. tied to the land and the sky but never to people. She was wrong. One evening in late September, as the first hints of autumn cooled the air, James arrived not with supplies but with a proposition. He sat on her porch, hat in hands, looking more nervous than she'd ever seen him. "Ma'am, Sarah, I've been thinking. I've got a good position waiting for me in Montana, foreman of one of the biggest ranches in the territory. It's steady work, good pay, a house that comes with the job. I know I'm not much, just a cowboy who's spent more time with cattle than people, but I'd be honored if you and Emma would consider coming with me, as my wife. I mean, if you'll have me." Sarah's breath caught. "You don't have to do this," she said. "You've already done so much. I won't be your obligation." James looked up then, and the vulnerability in his eyes was raw and real. "You're not an obligation, Sarah. These past weeks, watching you fight to give Emma a good life, watching you refuse to give up even when you had every reason to, that's changed something in me. I've been alone a long time, told myself I preferred it that way. But Emma's laugh, the way you hum when you're cooking, the sight of this little house with lamplight in the windows, that's made me realize I've just been scared. Scared of losing someone again like I lost my mother. Like I lost the girl I loved when I was young and too poor to give her the life she deserved. But I'm not poor anymore, and I'm tired of being scared. I'm not asking you to marry me out of charity. I'm asking because I love you, and I love that little girl. And I want to spend whatever time God gives me making sure neither of you ever has to choose between dignity and survival again." Sarah cried then. Really cried for the first time since Jacob's death, all the fear and grief and desperate hope pouring out. And then she said yes. Yes to Montana, yes to a new life, yes to this unexpected man who had seen her at her lowest and offered not pity but partnership. They married a week later in that same church James had fixed, with half the town in attendance, including Mr. Hutchins, who had the grace to look ashamed of himself. Emma wore a new dress James had bought her and carried wildflowers she'd picked from the prairie. The journey to Montana took 3 weeks, traveling in a covered wagon with a few possessions and the supplies James insisted they'd need. Along the way, Sarah learned about James's life, the loneliness of the cattle trails, the guilt he carried over his mother's struggles, the dreams he'd been too afraid to pursue. She told him about Jacob, about the love they'd shared and the grief of losing him, and James listened without jealousy, understanding that her past didn't diminish what they were building together. Emma rode between them, chattering about everything she saw, her cheeks growing rounder with regular meals, her eyes bright with the security of knowing she was safe. The ranch in Montana was more beautiful than Sarah could have imagined, set in a valley with mountains rising on all sides, grass as far as the eye could see, and a house that was simple but solid with room for a family to grow. James was true to his word, a steady provider, a gentle father to Emma, and a husband who treated Sarah like she was precious. But more than that, he lived by the principle his mother had taught him through her sacrifice. Word spread through the territory about the foreman who would never turn away someone in need, who always had work for a man down on his luck, who made sure no child in the valley went hungry if he could help it. Years passed and Sarah's hair grew even longer, silver threads eventually mixing with the gold. She never cut it, wearing it as a reminder not of what she had almost lost, but of what had been saved. Emma grew into a strong, kind woman who became a teacher, dedicating her life to helping children who came from hard circumstances. She married a good man and had children of her own, raising them with stories about the cowboy grandfather who had saved her mother with a simple act of kindness, teaching them that true wealth was unmeasured in dollars but in the difference you made when someone needed help. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Sarah and James sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. Sarah touched her hair still long and full, despite the years, and thought about that day in Red Creek, about the scissors she had been ready to use, about the stranger who had walked through that door at exactly the right moment. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't stopped that day?" she asked. James took her hand, his thumb rubbing over her knuckles in a gesture that had become as familiar as breathing. "Every day," he admitted. "But then I thank God I did, because the best 20 years of my life have been the ones I almost missed by riding on past." Sarah squeezed his hand, watching their grandchildren play in the yard, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. She thought about how close she had come to a different life, a life defined by that one desperate moment. Instead, because a cowboy had seen her worth when she felt worthless, she had built something beautiful, not just a marriage or a family, but a legacy of kindness that rippled outward, touching lives in ways they would never fully know. If this story touched something in you, share it with someone who needs to remember that their darkest moment might be right before their dawn. And if you have the means to help someone who's reaching for those scissors, whatever form those scissors might take, don't hesitate. You're not just changing their today, you're changing every tomorrow that follows, for them and for everyone they touch. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give is seeing someone's dignity when they can no longer see it themselves, and reminding them through our actions that they are worth more than they know.